Now that some time has passed since that movement started, a lot of people are asking, how have workplaces changed since the MeToo movement started? Overt sexual harassment perhaps is down. Research may be showing that there's a backlash going on. On this next panel, we're going to talk about how those things have changed, how to ensure progress continues, and what the next steps are to ensure more inclusivity and to address any setbacks. So please help me in welcoming our moderator, Stacy Perman. She's a staff writer at the LA Times, who will introduce the rest of our panel. Thanks so much, guys.
Oh, you want me? Sorry.
I think okay. Your mic's on. My mic works. Okay, good afternoon. I'm Stacy Perman. I'm a staff writer at the Los Angeles Times. I cover the business of Hollywood, so I've had the occasion to write stories related to MeToo, which is the subject of our panel today. It's been 2 years since the Harvey Weinstein stories first broke, ushering in the MeToo movement. So the question for us today is, how much has changed since then? How have companies responded and organizations responded? And we are going to have some time at the end for some questions, so you might want to start thinking about them as we talk. But I'm going to start with letting the panel introduce themselves. So let's start with Mandy.
Hi everyone, I'm Mandy Bynum Mc Laughlin. I am New Relic's Head of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, formerly our Head of Sales Development.
Hi, I'm Bex Port. I'm the VP of Talent, which is what we call HR at Netflix.
Hi everyone, my name is Neta Meidav. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Vault Platform. It's the next generation speak-up platform for the workplace.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jessica Childress, and I'm the managing attorney of the Childress Firm, a labor and employment law firm based in Washington, D.C.
Hi, I'm Zev Eigen. I'm the founder and chief data scientist of Syndio Solutions, which is a pay equity software as a service platform.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to start with kind of a broad question. I'm going to throw it out to anybody. There's been a lot of awareness that's come as a result of the Me Too movement, but is that change, and how so?
I can start. It's the extroversion in me. The conversation has definitely changed. What has changed due to the conversation change, though, is that there has been a lot of fear that has been in response of the exposure that you have as a leader, especially as a man. So there's been I feel like a little bit of over-rotation, which I'm sure you've written about. Also, what has not changed, and maybe what has been exacerbated, is the toll that is still taken on women or people who are marginalized who are taking the time to speak up. That is still the biggest challenge that we have, because that is still something that you're putting at risk by speaking up. The conversations and the leaders may have changed, but that tax has not.
I think that we see, from an employment law perspective, an increase in the number of sexual harassment filings. So what you'll see on the EEOC statistics from 2017 to 2018, you'll see the number of charges going down in terms of filings, but the number of sexual harassment charges have actually gone up. So I think that Mandy's absolutely right, that you have the awareness increasing and people are actually speaking up. But what you see is people might not be speaking up within companies, they might actually just be going to the EEOC to file cases, right, which is a huge issue with respect to workplace culture.
I completely agree. I think what the Me Too movement has exposed is that we're really witnessing a deficit of trust, a crisis of trust that exists within the workplace. So misconduct has always been there, and the big difference that we're seeing now is that the risk is finally borne by the company and not just the individual. It used to be the individual that would have to either leave or suck it up. Today, the companies wake up to the need of doing things differently because CEOs today leave their jobs because they got culture wrong. So they're responsible for the company's cultural health as much as they're responsible for the company's financial health, and it's their responsibility, which I think is a great thing that really happened in the last 2 years. It's finally brought up to the top of the agenda of boards and CEOs. They're listening.
So that's a good jumping off point. I think one of the things that has emerged in this discussion is the role of HR. Employees want to know that if they make a complaint, that it'll be taken seriously and they won't be retaliated against. And the question is, so is HR your friend or the enemy? We have some HR people here, so.
I would say not the enemy. I would also, I like to stay in the middle and say both. HR we're partners. We are partners. HR has a responsibility to protect the company, first and foremost. We as people managers have responsibility to drive revenue, drive performance, and sometimes those two things clash. I had one situation where on my sales development team, a manager was hired underneath me. I didn't get to interview him or do anything. You can probably guess what type of person put him under me. I knew that he had been touching butts, but because it wasn't egregious enough, I could not go to HR myself. So I had to take 3 months to build relationships with the women on the sales team to the point where they could finally have trust to confide in me about these issues and that I could be able to do something about it. We were able to let this person go, and he obviously had no idea that he was doing anything wrong. But as I was saying earlier, HR did launch an investigation. They wouldn't have had as much power to do that if I hadn't built up or had the women build up a case. And second, those women felt guilty for doing it and felt terrible. They felt so terrible that this person was let go, and that was the part that hurt me the most. That was the most painful to watch.
I mean, I do think it depends on the culture of the organization. So I think, and then also the culture of your HR. HR functions tend to divide into identifying as a control function or identifying as a facilitator of success. Certainly at Netflix, we identify as coaches and we identify as facilitators of success. One of the things that I think the culture does foster is about people being very candid. So if somebody was touching butts at Netflix, they would absolutely tell everybody about it, and we would instantly fire that person. And so I think that we certainly don't shy away from exiting people. If anybody's read our culture memo, we exit people and pay people to leave all the time. And so we just don't tolerate that kind of behavior. So I think what that means is that people trust that HR will do something about it. And so people are open. It's not that HR is going to do an investigation and somebody is senior and therefore it's brushed under the carpet. We don't tolerate brilliant jerks. It doesn't matter who they are. If they're a jerk, they'll get fired. And so I think it just depends on the kind of culture that you foster.
Have your companies enacted new measures as a result of the last 2 years? I mean, what changes are being put into play?
So we've doubled down on inclusion. So we didn't have inclusion as part of our culture memo. It now is a value, and we've hired a number of kind of inclusion experts to help us. And it's not just about MeToo. It's just about really making sure that we do pretty well in diversity. We've got 50% of our executive team are women. We have people from different nationalities, different races. But in terms of like the diversity, that's the easiest part. It's really the inclusion and making sure that everybody can come to work and be the best version of themselves.
So this leads me to ask a question. I think kind of the idea of reporting an incident is crucial. And actually I want to direct this to Neta, because you have a company that actually is addressing this issue of inefficient reporting systems. So talk to us about that. I know you have a personal story, how you got there. If you feel comfortable sharing that with us, I've just sort of put you on the spot, but feel free.
Yeah, I usually don't share that, but it's, I guess, I lead a company that is all about speaking up, so it should start with me. I started my company based on a personal experience I had when I was 22, and it was my first job out of university, and was my dream job. And I was harassed by a very powerful man, and I never even considered reporting it. Although there was a hotline in place, never even considered reporting it. I didn't want my career to be crushed by a powerful man before it even started. So I left that workplace, and I never saw myself as a victim really, but my life has taken on a completely different turn. Months later, after I left, I got a phone call from a colleague of mine who told me that the same individual harassed her and badly, actually assaulted her. And that, completely changed my perspective. And so years later, in the early days of when the Weinstein story broke, and was the early days of the MeToo campaign, and it seems to be picking up as this new movement, I actually realized that that's the missing link, because what we've learned from MeToo is that when one person comes forward, you feel and you see so many other people are coming forward as well. There's strength in numbers. So we've baked that concept into the platform, the enterprise platform that we currently have, to enable that psychological safety, enable individuals to have safe records of events that happen to them on their phones, timestamp records, and enable reporting. That one of the tracks that we enable is this opportunity to go together. You can submit under the condition you're not the first or only one, and our technology then connects the dots to see if there's a repeated pattern of harm, allowing individuals to come forward in more confidence, and companies to know about this before it becomes tomorrow's headlines or lawsuit, and before harm is done.
I think it's interesting that this is such an interpersonal, human interaction issue, but technology is coming into play. And Mandy, do you want to address that? Because I know you have some thoughts about the role that technology can play in providing a better reporting system, or any system.
Yeah, back to the partnership idea. There are only so many HR folks to go around, and even less budget. And HR business partners are so foundational to the culture, maintaining everyone's safety. What I've been working on my team with is acknowledging the fact that there is a gap, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. But let's not have folks have to wait 3 months to be able to report something that they're not sure about. Let's allow them to report anything anonymously, have it answered, and feel really empowered that they were able to speak up, but also take away that tax that they might have of speaking up and being the whistleblower who's seen and exposed, because that's putting themselves at risk. So we are currently evaluating companies to partner with to do that.
I guess now I want to talk about the law, because I think you cannot talk about this issue and not talk about the law. In reporting some of these stories, I remember a very prominent attorney who's represented a number of victims told me that the system perpetuates harassment rather than getting rid of it. And I know there are laws in place that companies have to take action if a complaint's been raised. So many companies say they have sexual harassment policies on the books and codes of conduct, and yet we've seen this explosion of incidents. So Jessica, you being the resident lawyer here, I'm going to direct this one at you. What needs to happen? Is this an issue that the law has to be reformed? Do companies have to come in better compliance? Or is this the culture is shifting the whole dynamic here?
Well, I represented both management and employees. And from what I see, employees, it's a super high burden to actually be successful on an employment discrimination or harassment case. So if you're an employee, you have a very high burden to actually reach a jury and get an actual verdict in your favor on a discrimination or a harassment case. But that doesn't mean that your company should set a super high legal standard within the company to actually be a viable company. Because if you're setting a super high standard, severe, pervasive, that's what the standard is for a hostile work environment. If that's your standard and if that's your code of conduct that you're training on, you're really missing the mark and you're creating an intolerable culture, right? So the law has to reform to create a code of conduct which is going to be commensurate with what's in your with what's in your code of conducts now. So what I mean by that is that the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which is what governs sexual harassment, that is not a civility code, and that's in a Supreme Court case. Justice Scalia came out and said Title VII is not a civility code. So the law doesn't require your workplace to be civil. However, I think all of us would say that a core value of your company is actually to be civil. So the law, I think Janine would agree with me, I attended her panel earlier, the law is not likely going to change, at least probably in my lifetime. The Supreme Court is not going to revert back on that tenet that Title VII is a code of civility. However, civility does need to be a core value, and companies need to train on what it means to be civil. And I think that that's going to really depend on the culture of the company. And Rebecca, I think you have a wonderful tenet in your company that radical candor is a core value of the company because it's hard to report harassment. It's extremely, extremely scary. I think that your data platform is amazing. However, the law requires the employee to take that burden of reporting or someone who is a bystander to actually report. And it's scary to be a bystander and report because you might lose your job. Retaliation is the highest, the number of retaliation charges filed, that's the highest number of charges that are actually filed with the EEOC. So even if you can't prove the underlying harassment, it's much easier to prove the retaliatory act. And if you're a supervisor, it's really hard to maintain your composure if you're called a harasser, because nobody wants to be called a harasser. It's hurtful. Oftentimes, the accuser may have had an interpersonal conflict with the supposed harasser, and that person just doesn't know how to respond. It's not human nature to act normal after someone's accused you of harassing someone else. So there has to be some sort of stopgap between the law and company culture, and I don't know that that will change, but I think that society, with the prevalence of social media, society is going to change, and societal mores are going to change much faster than what the law will.
We've already seen signs of that. Just here in California, about a year ago, companies have really started this wave of self-regulation by announcing that they're now moving away from mandatory arbitration, right? That was the practice. In the UK, it's the NDAs. Here it's the mandatory arbitration, basically this thing that stops you as an employee from being able to sue your company and on unlawful dismissal and on behavioral issues. But then companies basically said, we're going to stop that. So it's a voluntary invitation to legally challenge the company, which is an amazing step forward, and it's so important. It only builds the case further for companies to have a strong speak-up culture, because now more than ever, the company, the board, would want to know what's going on. That's the only way to really protect themselves from that risk.
To your point also, in January of this year, California enacted a law that abolished the use of NDAs in these settlements. New York has done the same thing. There are some other states following suit. So is this a step forward, or is this a positive step forward? I've heard both sides of that argument, allowing NDAs to be a part of the settlement, or no longer to be part of the settlement.
I think it depends on the employee. Not everyone wants to be a martyr, and it's great when the employee can speak up about what happened, but some employees are going to want that level of settlement. They want the peace that comes with the settlement agreement. So there are some employees that would definitely like to speak out if anyone ever questioned the employee about what happened. They do want to be the person to say, yes, this happened to me, because that discourse encourages changes in company culture. But it does depend, and I don't know that a blanket rule is necessarily going to change the culture of harassment, because I think every single employee is very different, and every case of harassment is very different.
Just kind of how like straws are not, plastic straws are not going to be our demise, and paper straws are not going to be our savior. It's a good step in the right direction, but we have a long way to go.
Well, and there is an argument made on the other side. I think that's what you were alluding to, that it's actually not always in the employee's best interest to have everything out in the open. And some employee groups have asked for, to have some balance there too. Arbitration isn't a forum where you have no rights. You actually still have rights asserted. So the argument goes, it's not like the courts are such a level playing field, right? So when you send employees, like as you were saying, it's not easy to go to court and say, and now everything will be great because the courts are this awesome level playing field and all the employees can rejoice because no. It's a terribly high burden, and to win in court and to have any remedy at all in court is very expensive, very cumbersome. So there have been, I think that was your point, there are some employee groups who are saying, hold on, let's pump the brakes. It's not all a panacea to have all the, the bans or everything like you said. It's like a step. It might be helpful, but you have to weigh it and evaluate it carefully.
I think it's important to talk about sort of the flip side of all of this, which is there is a backlash. There is a very vocal group of men. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to look at you.
I don't know where you're going, but it's probably, I'm pretty vocal on the other side.
who have said, their reaction to Me Too is now they're uncomfortable to mentor women. They're uncomfortable to be in a room alone with a woman. So, I mean, rather than get into the nitty gritty of that argument, I'm just, as companies, how do you respond to that? How do you get around that?
Hire better people.
Well, I didn't hear what you said.
Hire better people.
Hire better people.
Yeah, because I think people have got good judgment and they're exceptional employees. They won't find any solace in those arguments. I think that to your point, I think there is sometimes a fear, which I think is, which maybe some of our high-performing employers do, like, am I saying the right thing? My advice is, well, if you have to kind of check, am I allowed to say that? Then it's maybe best just not to say it. And so I think that the line has moved and people are uncomfortable sometimes where that line is. But I think those people that scaremonger and say, oh, that's it, I can't ever have lunch with a woman, I can't mentor a woman, I think that they're probably ineffectual employees.
I would add to your point, Jessica, and to you, Rebecca, that the initial reaction to being called a harasser brings conflict and brings out people's worst behaviors, and that is typically the first response. Like, I can't open a door for a woman. Like, what am I supposed to do? I just don't know. I've seen that in real life. But once that's like the beginning of the process, and then once folks get over that, I think there's a lot of change that can happen because. Were you fired for opening a door for someone? No. You won't be fired for, the next maybe thing, but it's good to just be more aware.
I think you have to call it out because I actually don't think it's a valid thing that people say. I think it's designed intentionally as a rhetorical device. It's a reductio ad absurdum argument, like exactly like you said, like, oh, now I can't do anything at the work. Like, they know, anyone who's making the argument knows that that's a BS argument. And it's rhetorical. It's not designed to actually be like, I don't understand what to do next. Help me. That's nonsense, and it should be called out. I don't know if it's hiring better people. That's one option, but like, I think you also have to call it out and say, no, that's not a valid response to this. If you genuinely don't understand how to behave at all, like, how do you function on the subway or like, what do you do? Like, you're like, I don't know. What do I? Like, that's a different problem.
But that is still a problem. I have these conversations every day. As a diversity and inclusion person at my company, and that conversation takes 2 hours. There's like, what do I do? It's like, well, first, like, don't do anything. Don't do anything. Just be aware, and then start to pay attention of what's happening. But I would say like that reaction is not. It's not conscious. It's just a subconscious, like, fragility response to any sort of conflict, I would say.
And I have to say, I mean, let's face it, we're not going to win this revolution alone. We have to take the guys with us, and along our journey, at least at Vault, we've met incredible male champions. Mm-hmm. We met incredible. I just want to, let's just give it to the guys because they're doing an amazing job championing this alongside us, and I really don't think that it helps kind of making this a kind of a women against men issue. We really need to take everyone with us on this, and they all have mothers and sisters and daughters and girlfriends and wives, and we're doing this for society on the whole.
For everybody. I think when we talk about this, there's an issue that doesn't really get as much play, but we are talking about power dynamics, and so not unrelated is the issue of pay. And Zev, I'm going to address this to you because this is kind of your thing, but talk to us about the role of pay inequity and power dynamics and how you see it linked. And I know your company works to eradicate it. What are you seeing in companies that you work with?
Yeah, first and foremost, I think what we've seen as part of the MeToo movement is this move more towards transparency about problems that have been endemic in the workplace. And harassment, of course, is one of those things, and pay equity is another one of those things, which there's a lot of opacity around how much you're getting paid, why you're getting paid, what you're getting paid, and is there a difference between how men and women and people of different races and other protected categories are being paid for their work. Let's be real clear. Work is personal. Anyone who tells you, oh no, this is not personal, that's nonsense. Like, I've never worked at a place where I didn't think there was a personal thing, and it should be, because this is how the company's valuing you. They're basically saying, the only thing you have to exchange in your life is your time. That's the only thing that you can sell, and you can't generate more of it. If you can, please tell me how to do that. I'd like to know how to do that. Maybe you can put my brain in like a robot brain. But I don't think you can do that yet. So you have a finite amount of time you're selling, and your employer is paying you for that time. If they pay you less because of your gender, that's basically them telling you, I don't care how much you're worth, and you're worth less than someone else because of their gender, because of their race. So that is A, very personal, and B, it's something that was opaque and not transparent, and now as part of the MeToo movement, we definitely see more transparency around making sure that people are paid equitably and fairly. And for sure, that's Syndio's mission. We have a software as a service, a SaaS company that helps organizations get this right. And one thing I will say that has come up a lot, because it's great that people are bringing this to the attention. It's in the public a lot, it's in the public eye. Companies are shamed rightfully if they get it wrong. I think that's a correct response. So there is more attention on the public side. There are laws that have been passed, pay equity laws. But one thing that I find really interesting, and this is sort of part of this conversation too, I think, is I've been at conferences where well-intentioned people want to put the burden on getting this right on the employees.
Yeah.
And I've been on panels. I was at one recently I was a former academic, so sometimes I get invited to academic conferences, and there were two panels. One was an employer perspective, and I was on that panel talking about how employers should get this right. And there was another well-intentioned panel explaining how women need to speak up and get this right, and if they don't, it's not going to happen. And I respectfully raised my hand and said, with respect, I'm all in favor of I've taught women how to be better negotiators. I'm a big fan of it. Fantastic. I have 2 kids. I want them to be great. I want my daughters to be great negotiators too. But with all respect, you don't have to be a good negotiator to get any other things that are protected under the law. In other words, you don't have to negotiate to get minimum wage. No one says, hey, you have to, if you don't negotiate, you're not entitled to minimum wage. No, you're not entitled to overtime whether or not you're a good negotiator. So why are we putting a burden on women to ask to be a better negotiator to get fair pay? To me, it's entirely on the burden of the employer. Of course, thank you. Of course, people should be negotiators to get more, of course, but to get what's required in terms of fairness and equity, that's on the employers, and employers have to get it right. And I think it's part of this movement. The NWLC, I'll shut up. The NWLC, I got excited, sorry. The National Women's Law Center, which has really funded a lot of the litigation around MeToo. Syndio partners with them because we like the NWLC, see pay equity as a fundamental issue, and actually human right that everyone deserves, and it's not a women's issue, it's a fairness issue.
Netflix has a transparency around pay. Maybe how does that play out? What's the upshot of that?
Yeah, so we basically have open comp, open conversations. So you can see, if you're a director and above, you can see what anybody is paid anywhere across the company. And we do that because we think that it's about fairness and openness, and we're not ashamed of what we pay people. We don't intend to pay some groups more than other groups. You will get paid your personal top of market. Now that's very difficult to work out, and we expect our leaders to lean in to understand what that market is. But what it means is that we don't have a gender pay gap. We actually find that the median pay between men and women is very similar, and the average, I think women are slightly higher in terms of the average pay. And yeah, we don't find a gender pay gap. If you look at two people doing the same job, they will get paid the same. What it does do is it means that employers can also own some of that. I think one of the challenges is getting access to what is my market and what should I be paid. We encourage people to speak to recruiters. We encourage people to go out and get other job offers to find out what is your market, like what are you worth out there. Now that doesn't necessarily always address the gender pay gap, because if there is a gender pay gap, a male colleague may get offered higher than a female colleague, but we are certainly cognizant of it. And so I think transparency is great. The flip side of that is that some people are not mature with access to lots of information, and they want to know, why are you paid more than me, and why is your market higher than me? And sometimes that can take a lot of time to explain, but I think on the whole, from a gender pay gap perspective, it's certainly beneficial.
And that's the work it takes. Like, you have to be able to be vulnerable enough on a larger scale that you're inviting that pushback, and because it opens up the conversation and it helps you fix.
Yeah. And leaders need to own the decisions they make. So if we have the same boss and they choose to pay you multiple millions of dollars more than me, then they've got to rationalize it. And so it's kind of owning the decisions.
We have a few minutes left before the Q&A, so I do want to ask, this is open to all of you, and I hope you all jump at the question, is kind of, what would you say are the most profound changes that you've seen, but also more importantly, what concrete steps have to happen next that really haven't happened, or are maybe on the cusp of happening?
I think the biggest change that I've seen is people willing to subtly say, no, that's not acceptable. So, like, don't touch my ass. Or not so subtly. But whereas I think people might have, tolerated some inappropriate behaviors and like microaggressions, or even like firm aggressions, and kind of, whereas I think people now in the moment are actually stopping and saying, no, don't do that, or don't say that. That makes me feel uncomfortable. And so I think that that's one of the biggest changes. I think in terms of kind of next steps, I'll go back to what you said in terms of kind of just continuing to harness the movement and make sure that it doesn't become a kind of he versus she thing, that it is really about kind of creating inclusive communities and continuing to do that.
I could give an example of that. I just have so many good examples. There was a leader in one of the companies I worked for. We were at a conference together, and it was during a happy hour. I was having a conversation with someone else, and this person came up and touched my face and told me to smile. I know.
Did you smile?
I know I can't curse up here. So, however, like, because it's a different time, I pulled him aside and said, what the are you doing? Don't you ever touch my face. And his response was, well, everyone should smile. And I was like, you don't do that all the time. There's a reason why people think you're a prick. So we were able to have that conversation, and I don't think everyone's able to do that. It takes practice and confidence. But I think we are getting to the point where I can have that conversation, and that person can say, I'm really sorry, I didn't mean for that to impact you, won't ever happen again, and then we get back to business. So I'd say that's like the biggest thing, is those little exceptions of fault and ability to move on are great.
I think that the biggest change we're seeing is, at kind of at the top levels, is this shift from compliance and ethics to culture and diversity. And to address this problem of underreporting of harassment, bullying, discrimination in the workplace, leaders, HR, are all waking up to that understanding that they must create psychological safety in the workplace, that they must shift the conversation from process and grievance procedure to let's enable a conversation, let's give our people the best possible routes to speak up, and let's make sure that we give them the message that we will listen. And I think that kind of also connected to what are the next steps. It's a great moment, in my view, for HR. Anyone here who is in a diversity and inclusion function, congratulations, because that's the fastest growing segment within HR for C-suite positions. There is a reason for that, because there's now a seat at the table. You're the gatekeepers of your company's culture, and culture is the most important asset that companies have today to recruit and retain the best talent. So it's now yours to own and to prove, and the best way to do that is stop outsourcing trust externally. Own it, and make sure that your people know that you're the ones to be trusted. And I think that's the best thing that came out of this movement for the corporates.
I think, no worries. I think that we are living in a really unique political time. I think it's very scary for several populations of the world: women, people of color, LGBT communities, immigrants. And we are in a unique place. HR professionals are in a unique place. Lawyers are in a unique place to really change culture, not just workplace culture, but culture in general. And in workplace culture, I think there's a huge fear. I think that we've touched on this. Men are scared. They don't know what to do. Harassment's not a male-female issue. It's an issue that affects all genders. But women are the recipient, or higher recipients, or they receive harassment. They're subjected to harassment at higher rates. And so men are scared. And in that fear, I think there's a lot of growth that can be had. And that discourse, it's up to us to open up a place for discourse and to have safe spaces, to allow questions and to give candid answers. This makes me feel uncomfortable. I'll give a personal story, but about how scary it is to speak up. I was at a bar conference in Virginia, in like the boondocks somewhere. I'll never go there again because it was just super scary. But I'm sitting there with some other attorneys, some women attorneys, and an older gentleman comes over and says to the women, "Oh, you ladies look beautiful today, sweeties," or "honey," and it was just the most like repulsive thing. And he continued to make comments on our appearance. And I really wished in that moment that someone had spoken up for me, even though I very well could have spoken up for myself. And so this is very much a time where states are requiring companies to train people on what constitutes harassment under the law. But that's just not enough, because many people just don't know, as I experienced at this conference with this very senior attorney who thought it was okay to call a bunch of women attorneys sweetheart and women and talk about their appearance, which would not be sexual harassment under the law. But it certainly made me feel uncomfortable. It certainly made me wish someone had spoken up on my behalf. And in that moment, I thought, well, Jessica, why didn't you say something? Aren't you an attorney? Don't you do this for a living? But it was still very, very intimidating. And so this is a really, really cool place for us as HR professionals, for you as HR professionals, for me as an attorney and trainer, to educate the workforce on how to speak up, on what culture really, really means. And I think that we'll have a greater impact, not just within companies, but in America, which is awesome.
Thank you. Do give us your answer. I know we're running out of time, and I know people have questions, but I don't want to cut you off.
I just want to give a very fast shout out to technology. So this is a time where we have great solutions, two of them sitting in front of you, but many more as well, to empower you as HR leaders, as D&I leaders, to get this right. So it's not just what I refer to as admiring the problem.
Right.
We've had a lot of years, I've been on a lot of panels with people, quote unquote, what I call admiring the problem, and not having actionable solutions that they can buy and implement today to start solving the problems. That's what Syndio does, that's what Vault does, that's what other really great technological solutions are. Netflix is a great example of how a technology disrupted how we view content and how content is consumed. It should be of no surprise to anyone here that technology is doing the same thing in this space as well. And I invite you to check out all those opportunities that are in front of you.
Thank you so much. This was a really great panel, and I'm sure we have some questions, and we have a few minutes for those. So This lady back here.
Thank you. Really great panel. Thank you. The question I have is kind of sparked by Mandy and then your comment here on this backlash, the idea of backlash. How do we step into that fear that men are experiencing without owning their experience, A, because it's kind of happening to where it's like not only did you own for years being the victim, now you own my reaction to now being afraid of it. Like, how do we keep the ownership where it belongs on those who are experiencing the fear, and how do we make it a learning and not have it be a backlash and a retrenching?
It takes practice. I work with people of all genders and ethnicities all day long who are always often addressing this problem, whether they're the person who has been called out, how do I handle that, or they are struggling with, I wish I would have said something, I wish someone would have said something on my behalf. People are at all different levels of that journey. So I think what we as DEI practitioners have to do is kind of take the guilt off of the person, but not let them off the hook. But if you are the person who's being, I guess, aggressed, it's gonna take practice. One time you might pull the person over in private and say, I was really uncomfortable. Before that, you might even call a girlfriend and say, this is what happened to me, what should I have done, just so you can have validation that you are not crazy. So again, just the little steps, I think, are what helps us, as all people, really do the work that's needed to create equality. Hopefully that answers your question a little bit.
And fear is not a bad thing. I actually think it's a good thing when someone shows that they're taking these issues seriously, because the person who creates the misstep within the company is the person who's negligent. It's usually not intentional conduct. It's the person who doesn't care enough to read the policy or listen during training or ask the woman, did I make you feel uncomfortable? It's the person who makes the locker room joke and just makes it a number of times and then creates this, it becomes the creep. And so that's the person who is the bad actor. So the person who's afraid, who actually wants to know more, that's the person who actually is ready to engage in conversation and is actually going to have an open ear. So I actually like that person in the company. And I think that it's important that companies create a space for the scared employee and talk to that person about, okay, this is what harassment is, this is what it isn't, but beyond just the very mundane, rote sexual harassment definition that the law requires you to train on.
I think you're differentiating between like a valid level of fear and like what you described earlier as what I think of as an invalid level of like rhetorical fake fear.
Right.
Right? Because I think you're referencing the former, not the latter.
The issue, if someone says, I don't want to mentor female employees, now that's ridiculous, and I think that's an invalid fear. But if someone says, I don't know if what I did was actually harassing conduct, I think that's a very valid fear, because the law is very ambiguous. There's several shades of gray, and I think that's where we can have a very real conversation about, well, why would you think that that made this employee feel uncomfortable? Mm-hmm. What can we do to make our training policies a little bit more clear? Is there would you like to talk to HR? Would you like to talk to the employee in a controlled setting where this isn't litigation, this is just a conversation? And that's the employee who actually is helping to change workplace culture, so that employee who may have been offended by an act or a comment, that employee actually has a chance to voice their concerns, and the scared employee has a chance to voice their concerns.
It's not perfect.
Never perfect.
Any other questions?
A question.
Oh,
Yes.
Do you want a microphone?
Talking about the backlash to the MeToo movement, and we talk about, I've heard, current employees who are apprehensive in terms of, mentoring or managing women or people of color. How has it impacted? Has you experienced any backlash in your recruiting and selection process? Meaning, you put in front of me a cisgender white male. We have enough of them. I mean, have you experienced that?
questions? Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
How do you combat that?
Which part? Who's
Well,
angry?
The recruiting process, and the selection process. They may interview, and the person may be, aptly qualified just as the rest. When it comes to, so what's the deciding factor? And you have everybody with the same qualifications and experience. The deciding factor comes down to either a person of color or, a cisgender white male. So, and so I find, and I've seen it and I've heard from some of my colleagues that people are leaning towards, just based on that, their selection process, when you have everybody in terms of their qualifications and experience on the same level playing field.
I think, as Jessica said, it's so nuanced and so gray. At the end of the day, for someone like me, I have to take the responsibility off of myself to move the needle in terms of representation, because I can't be in the room when that person's being hired or being decided about. All I can really do is help influence the system, so help provide processes around how to interview better, help our talent acquisition team be connected to people who can help them change as people first, so that they can really embody in a more effective way what diversity means, and they can push back against the business better. So it's tough, because there are some times where people will be hired because they're a person of color, and that isn't necessarily a bad thing. There's also times where the person of color is definitely not hired because the average majority, less melanated person fits the description a little bit better, and we're in a rush to hire. We're in such a rush. So there's always a good excuse for who you hire. It's just a matter of what you do the next time.
I think we have time for one more. Is there one here? Oh, right here.
Don't know how to phrase this exactly. I'm trying to learn clearly about this. But one of the things that I have been taught is that an important part of all of this is learning communication skills. That such things as asking consent. If I'm not sure, I'm clearly not going to ask, can I touch your butt? That's, the wrong question. I get that. I made that much progress.
That's good to know.
But are you comfortable if we're in a room, with just the two of us or something like that? And getting consent, but also mirroring back. Like the guy who says, I'm really not comfortable mentoring a woman. If we're not too quick, if we are too quick, we just say, well, you ought to be fired, or we ought not to have ever hired you, or that's BS, or that's rhetorical. We may miss a chance to get at what's really bothering that person by being too quickly judgmental, and I am just tossing this out, this not to be critical of anyone on the panel, but just to ask, what do you think is the role of communication skills, of us teaching all of us how to talk to each other better in helping this process?
Yeah, I think it goes back to kind of what Zev said. There's obviously, in any situation you approach it with seeking to understand. And I think there is a true distinction between kind of real fear and, look, I'm anxious about this, I want to do this well, I want to do this right, I want to be helpful, I want to have impact, versus I'm being flippant or nonchalant and kind of aggressively reacting against something that I don't like and trying to exercise power. And I think at the absolute core of that is communication skills in terms of like, how do you understand from the individual, how the individual communicates to you, and how you kind of differentiate between those, because they're not always super obvious. I think there is a degree of humility with the former and a degree of arrogance with the latter that actually is reasonably reasonably easy to kind of sense out by the questions that a person asks. But yeah, ultimately communication skills are key to all of that.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to suggest that anyone who doesn't feel exactly the way I feel, like I personally feel like it's crazy for someone to react that way. Like my personal belief is like, I've mentored so many, I was an academic for 6 years, I've had so many female students, I've mentored so many female grad students. Never for half a second would I ever think like, oh, I don't know what to do, never. So to me it's foreign and crazy. But that said, if someone has a realistic fear about how to do it, and they're like, I don't know, I struggle, I have trouble communicating, I don't know. If it's real and it's genuine, it comes from a real place, I think it's correct to like figure out a good way to communicate. What I was differentiating was on people who are using it as a rhetorical device.
Yeah, likewise.
And throwing up their hands and going, well, now I just can't do any work because women are in the workplace and I don't know what to do. Can I talk to women? Like, yes, you're allowed to say hello to women. They're not gonna, like that.
Yeah.
But that's not a genuine
is real.
fear.
Like that
Yeah,
is
is
what,
real.
what that reaction is real. So,
Yeah, but it's not. But that's not a genuine fear. That's my
Yes.
point. That's not someone who like genuinely is like, oh my gosh, I don't know what to do. I'm paralyzed. It's more like someone like, I know what to do, and all of you people are telling me what to do, and you're all wrong, and I'm right, and I know what to do. That's someone who thinks they know better than everyone else. That's a very different mindset than someone who's open to learning how to communicate and be better. And they're like, look, I'm nervous because I'm not great at mentoring women. I don't know how to, I'm not good at this. Can someone help me? Very different mindset. That's a genuine fear, and I think we should respect that and help people get it right.
And by the way, there are companies today that are, that are helping those who are very, very nervous and they just don't know what to do with some, basic rules that are in place. I just heard that
Software
Airbnb
developers? Oh, sorry.
introduced, sorry?
I said software developers? No.
Software.
It's an inside joke among the
Bless.
technologists. Yeah.
Bless the software developers.
So I just heard that Airbnb introduced this rule that says that if you, it's okay to ask a coworker out on a date, and as long as they don't report to you or they're not on that kind of management line. And if that person says no once, it's not okay to ask again, because a second time would be kind of that will constitute harassment. So so you see companies kind of really trying to spell it out for those who are very, very nervous or anxious. But I really think, and very much kind of based on everything that we've discussed here today, is that those who really need to be concerned are those who need to be concerned for a reason. This movement is about them. This movement is about the harassers and the bullies and the discriminators, and they know who they are. And the role of business leaders and the role of technology is to drive behavioral change. Some is already happening, and we're hearing about a backlash, but it only means that this movement has worked. It's funny, it says time's up on the screen there. Like, yeah. And some will happen over time, and some will happen over time as we adjust to this new world. But let's just remember what the last 2 years have been about. They've been about a pivotal moment in our history as women, a pivotal moment for the workforce, a pivotal moment for diversity and inclusion, and we need to celebrate that. So let's just let's just celebrate that.
And with that, time's up. Thank you so much.